Now I'd like to invite Professor Birgit Glorius to set the scene for us. She is involved in a number of research and multi-stakeholder projects and focuses on the integration also in rural areas. So Birgit, what is the role of communities of practice in driving innovation and creating sustainable integration approaches? What are your observations and what might be promising examples in facilitating a dialogue between research and practice within or between existing communities?
Thank you, Marion. Thanks for the invitation to the workshop. And yeah, you gave me a couple of very interesting and challenging questions. And while thinking about, I was preparing some slides because I think that we can discuss better, or you can follow my thoughts better if I have those slides and share them with you. Communities of practice as drivers of innovation and creators of sustainable integration approaches. That's the question for today. And actually, as a geographer, I fell over communities of practice and the term during my research on European migration processes. So not related to integration, but rather to the idea what kind of innovation migrants transport with them and bring back when they migrate back to their home country. So that was the origin kind of my thinking about communities of practice. And as an academic scholar, of course, I first have to define for myself and for you, or to create a common understanding of this term. I was told that in the Spring project, you have a definition of communities of practice being groups of professionals which are informally bound to one another through exposure to a common class of problems, common pursuit of solutions, and thereby themselves embodying a store of knowledge. And if you reflect on that terminology, you find that this is embedded in the sociology of knowledge, first off, and then second in the theory of practice, which was created by Pierre Bourdieu and others. Sociology is always differentiating between structure and agency. So we can say that the structures are on different scales. So we have external structures, which are maybe generalized or objectivized frames, which also communities of practice have to follow, which they cannot change or influence. And then we have proximate structure layers, which are, for example, for a local community, the context, for example, of local governance or local financing or the rules of their organization and so on. And then the other big notion in the sociology of knowledge is practice. So what is meant by practice in this sociological perspective? It is a number of issues of, in fact, it is routines, it is innovative strategies, and the evaluation of those routines and innovative strategies. As O'Reilly states, practice is about knowing how to go on in specific circumstances where internal and external structures meet. And I think that's a very good starting point for thinking about communities of practice, that these are groups of persons who have or who create common routines, also innovative strategies, who have to reflect and evaluate what they are doing, considering that their practices are embedded in specific structures and thus may not be transferred one by one. So communities of practice, to be more detailed on that, are based on collective experiences which they derive from situated learning and reflexivity. Those communities form on very different levels, but usually by shared experiences, mostly in everyday situations. So this can be a group of school teachers. This can be a group of neighbors living in a shared neighborhood. Very common is the workplace as a community of practice, or a mixture of all of that. And then specific is that they have a common goal. So they are driven by common interests. This can be a common obligation, for example, a social obligation, moral obligation, but maybe also a common goal in terms of a business goal to achieve, or a common vision to achieve. And this is, of course, specific. Sorry, if you think about the effect of communities of practice for sustainable integration approaches. And that was the first question for me to answer. What is the role of communities of practice in driving innovation and creating sustainable innovation approaches? Looking into the field, which I can observe mainly in the field of migration, but also integration of asylum seekers during the last years, and especially, of course, with the focus in Germany, I have to say it varies. The impact varies, the sustainability varies. And what I can observe is that it's really important that experiences are collected systematically, that they are reflected, that they are documented and also shared. And all those pieces of knowledge are embedded, and those communities are embedded either in geographical space, for example, in a locality, or in a focal space, in a topical space. And we know that, as I said, since long, from migration research, what you can see on this picture here, that's the Federation of Turkish parents institutions in Germany, that's like derives from the times of the so-called guest worker migration in the 1960s and 70s, when those families of the first labor migrants reunited in Germany. They found that there was no integration structure for families, notably for the children. There was not even the obligation that those children from guest workers have to go to school. And there was no integration infrastructure at schools. And that was the point when parents from Turkish origin, Greek origin, Spanish origin, and so on, formed communities of practice, which institutionalized over time. As you can see now, it's an institution trying to provide better support for their children and to have to play a bigger role in the communication with teachers, with school directors, but also with political stakeholders. And this is evident and in practice until today. And if you read this page, you can find out that they, meanwhile, this Federation of Turkish Parents is also engaging for refugee children. So they are transferring their knowledge of integration into the educational infrastructure in Germany for the newly arrived migrants. What new trends can we observe since 2015 and 16? And this is especially in Germany was the time when we received hundreds of thousands, near 1 million in effect, of asylum-seeking migrants. A lot of them of very young age, a lot of them were children. And this raised a spontaneous and really tremendous engagement of individuals who somehow wanted to help. So you had a lot of spontaneous action and a lot of grassroots engagement. Many of those spontaneous persons had a high motivation, but very few knowledge. So they started from scratch. They had no intercultural sensitivity. They had no ideas about the social support system or integration politics in Germany. So they really started from scratch and really profited from forming communities of practice. We had spontaneous institutionalizations or institutions which were switching their purpose. For example, we had communities of practice who found out that they would be stronger if they institutionalize themselves and make a foundation or something. And we had institutions who were in place already before 2015 and who just found that they could transfer their specific knowledge on these new groups and this new challenge of integrating asylum-seeking migrants. I will give you some examples in a minute. Just first, thinking about the sustainability of those activities. And again, we have to say it varies. This huge wave of spontaneous help. At some point in time, a survey brought out that every second German citizen somehow was engaged in refugee relief work. Over time, over the years, there was a point of exhaustion and disappointment among those grassroots helpers who were just experiencing that integration was a really, really stressful and long-lasting endeavor, and that trying to change structures in the social support system, in the political system, was really strenuous, and many of them were really exhausted at that point and disappointed. And this led to, on the one hand, the withdrawal of volunteers, but also to the politicization of actors. For example, in Bavaria, we had a group of employers who were really fed up that their young asylum-seeking migrants who had a very unstable status could not pursue their vocational education, which lasts 3 years, and they had no admission for that time, no residence permit. And this group of employers united to launch a petition against the Bavarian parliament to change the policies to give those young persons the opportunity to stay in Germany and finish their vocational education. So there was a politicization process of actors and activation process. And on the other hand, we had institutionalization processes, meaning that groups of spontaneous helpers found that they could be stronger if they give themselves an institutional structure, and by this are eligible, for example, for applying for funding or have a stronger voice in political processes, especially on the local level. And a third consequence was that we had a mainstreaming of integration structures. What we also follow in the Horizon project, whole of community approach, integration as a whole of community approach, we can call it a demigrantization of structures, meaning that people found out that problems that, for example, asylum-seeking migrants have are not problems which are exclusive for asylum-seeking migrants, but special for specific social groups. So that if you expand your services and your engagement to this wider social group, more people in the locality can profit from this. And I brought one example, which is a local example from the town where I live. It is an institution which started as a social service for homeless people, trying to help them find an apartment, find housing, and to overcome the discrimination in the housing market. And when in 2015-16, many asylum-seeking migrants came into the city, and after a while, when they had their refugee status, had to move out of the refugee accommodation, were confronted with a very dense housing market and were confronted with the same discrimination and with missing knowledge how the housing market in Germany works at all. And this was the point when this institution opened up their services and developed a service, an individualized service for migrants searching for housing. And they, meanwhile, like within 3 years, they found housing for more than 1,200 households, migrant households in Leipzig. So this is an example how an organization opened up to new user groups and expanded their services. A second example is a grassroots project-like organization which developed in a neighborhood, also in the city where I live. In 2015, it was first of all, it was a grassroots activity of members of 2 local churches who organized language classes for refugees, and quickly found out that there is a long-lasting need for all kinds of integration services, not only learning German, but also consultancy, also support for finding a good school, for pursuing an education, for getting a qualification, or doing the next step into, for example, vocational education. And that's why they institutionalized themselves after 2 years. As you can read here, they say the term project, which they had in the beginning, implies that this is a temporary activity. However, we realized a continuing demand for education and consultancy. At the same time, the focus changed from mere language learning to supporting educational goals in school and vocational education. That's why we decided to give integration and education, that's the name, a stable foundation, which is a foundation now. It's eligible to apply for funding. They have one person who is employed there, who is doing the coordination work, and they expanded their services, but they are located in a neighborhood and really developed from a grassroots neighborhood, locally embedded activity. Let's turn back to thinking about what new trends we could observe since 2015-16. A second point which we could observe and which became stronger evidently during the last year, during the pandemic, is the effect of digitalization and the use of social media. This is a process since long, but it was really accelerating during the last year because all of us had to engage in social media and in digital practices, and really learned a lot, really acquired knowledge. And in the case of communities of practice, doing integration support work, we can see that the digitalization process brings new opportunities for the mobilization of helpers, of volunteers and so on, but also self-empowerment for certain groups which are without digital tools not as visible as with digital tools. We see a lot of participatory approaches with the help of digital tools. The inclusion of migrants, and also, of course, and you can see it today in this workshop, the inclusion of geographically distant actors, which would never have the opportunity to meet without those digital tools. And just as a visualization of that, I brought you a screenshot of the Album magazine. That's a journal, a digital journal, which is created by a Syrian refugee who is living in the city of Dresden in Germany. And as you can see, it's bilingual, it's German and Arabic, and it is meant as being a platform to the Arabic-speaking community in Germany, and a bridge between the German community and the Arabic-speaking community. And it works like this, that you can post articles which are translated into the other language which you cannot practice. Let's get to the last point, the question how we can do this transfer work, how we can facilitate the dialogue between research, between practice, between politicians, practitioners and scientists and so on. Just some ideas about that which I observed during the last years. There are a lot of existing networks. For example, in Germany, German localities a lot of them are engaged in the Eurocities network. And there are some projects also like Coopstadt, which connect cities and really make dense networks between localities. And I call it hitchhiking, like communities of practice could use those networks, those already established networks, to promote their ideas and to promote their knowledge and to use the existing contacts and the existing tools and the existing support to fuel their ideas. We have social welfare organizations who form big networks which span over Germany or also worldwide. We have student communities which have networks. We have political parties or political foundations or also non-political foundations which have their own networks and facilities and support. And we can, our communities of practice can use those networks to facilitate the distribution of their knowledge. Digital solutions, as I said, are a very good tool. Of course, they have to be simple, they have to be accessible, and language is also always an issue. In Germany, we realize that if we only make our dissemination work in English, it's not accessible to political stakeholders on the local level. Of course, they can speak English, but they are not really used to do it on an everyday basis. Though, and as they don't have a lot of time, no politician has, you really have to streamline your information and you have to give it in the mother tongue. So that's additional work you have to do, and of course additional competencies to create those digital solutions. And as a scientist and academic, I have to say, this is not my everyday work. So for doing this translation work, translation into the digital world, making it simple, making it nice, and so on, I really need support. The third point and last point for my presentation is that communities of practice, which sometimes derive from grassroots activities, first of all have to identify themselves as being a community. Sometimes people or also organizations are working parallelly next to each other and don't identify themselves as community of practice. So this is, I think, a first point which is important, and this is already part of an institutionalization process, which we saw in the examples I showed you, which in the end helps to creating more stability and reaching out to audiences which you cannot reach when you are only a loose group of people who have the same idea and the same approaches. So that's all I wanted to share with you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Birgit, for giving so concrete examples to the term community of practice. And yeah, I mean, I didn't want, because I didn't fulfill my role of keeping an eye on the time, because I really didn't want to stop you, because I found it fascinating how you managed somehow, yeah, really give examples what research can do, what practice is doing. That was a really interesting scene setting. Thank you very much.